Thank you. Welcome, everyone. People are still arriving, but I want to begin. Welcome to all the regulars and to new people, and particularly welcome to our guests. This week's Knowing Africa seminar is looking at a book written by Rogers Orock and Peter Geschiere, and I have to say it was a rollicking read. My goodness, I was taken down pathways that communal garden political historians like myself don't often think about. So thank you for this fantastic book. I'm going to introduce the panel and then we will begin with the presentations. So we have two co-authors today, Rogers Orock, my old friend from Wits University, an anthropologist originally from the Cameroon and educated in Cameroon and in Denmark, now teaching in the United States at the University of Lafayette, at Lafayette College. There are several Lafayettes in the US. So Lafayette College. Rogers' earlier work is on elites in West Africa, and I know him for his work thinking about elite, about morality and leadership and corruption among West African elites. For this book, he's kind of picked up actually on the elite, on the story of the elites, and takes his work in conversation with his co-author, Peter Geschiere, who has for a long time been working on questions of witchcraft. Peter is emeritus professor at the University of Amsterdam and has worked in West and Central Africa. We know him, I know him from his book, Witchcraft and Intimacy and Trust, which is 2013. And his earlier book on the modernity of witchcraft, which I think has really been a path-breaking way of thinking about witchcraft differently from, the way in which, certainly in political studies, there's a tendency to think of it as attaching to some backward past. So welcome to the two amazing co-authors. We have great interlocutors today. Katrien Pype, who is not... the person you see is the person who should have been on the poster. Which we got wrong. So a public apology to Katrien, also an anthropologist at the University of Leuven in Belgium, and Meredith Terreta, a historian, our colleague over at the University of Ottawa. So welcome to both of you. Thank you for agreeing to read this wonderful book and to share your thoughts with us. Right, I'm going to hand over first to Rogers.
Well, thank you very much, Shireen, for not only the invitation to come discuss our book here in your series, but the very generous introduction that you offered to Peter and myself, as well as the two panelists who will be discussing the book with us. So I'll start off by saying that for us, it was a delight working on this book. And Peter and I, the story starts off when I was finishing my PhD in Denmark, and Peter was examining the dissertation. And when we had finished, we started, talking about, common things in Cameroon that we find fascinating. And certainly Freemasonry and homosexuality came up quite at the top of our interests. And in 2015, already, we each started, in bits and pieces writing. Peter actually started a little bit earlier with a short essay on homosexuality in Cameroon. And then we built up all these earlier interests on elites, on homosexuality. But I think the big a puzzle for us for the book was how it is that people were able to seem capable of assembling together things and ideas and materials that may not seemingly have any relationship into a coherent narrative. So, for instance, people were telling stories about Freemasonry and Rosicrucianism, but also telling stories about same-sex relations among the elites, and also linking these to the general evolution of spectacular enrichment among the elites in Cameroon. And we became drawn to this, to what Peter and I call associations, how people are making these associations, these connections. And so I think for us, the other interesting thing is that this remained very much within the realm of rumor and gossip. So that rumor mongering and gossiping are the kind of important vehicles through which people narrated what seemed like monumental transformations in the political and social landscape in Cameroon. And one concept, for instance, that was very commonly used is the idea of anusocracy. The idea of the annus as a kind of site or channel through which people narrate these transformations. And so
maybe you
perhaps
should say Rogers, maybe you should say what aristocracy means.
Yes.
So they may not know what it means.
I wanted to share some slides. I don't know if we will
Oh,
have.
sorry.
Yes. So I'll try to share this with you and see. Yes. Will work. Yes. So if you can, I hope you can see the slides.
Yes.
Good. So in terms of the structure of the book, the book is organized in into five chapters and divided also, I think, by two interludes. One on gender, the question of gender, which kind of looms large across the book, but is never really the object of a specific chapter. So we have a small interlude there to discuss a little bit what we think are some of the dynamics involved there. The second has to do with the institutional evolutions related to Freemasonry and Rosicrucianism, and the question of the post-colonial state and the connections between these and the lodges outside of Africa, Francophone Africa itself, and particularly the dynamics, the differences between what we think is the difference between Anglophone and Francophone Africa a little bit. I'm not so sure why the slides are not moving, but it doesn't seem to work on my side. So the first thing I would like to talk about is the idea of anusocracy, which is central to the book. And in the book, it is chapter 3. And it is for us, I think, the concept that ties together or makes possible the understanding of the relationship between Freemasonry, homosexuality, and the idea of illicit enrichment. Anusocracy comes to the fore in a moment, I think we document in the book, in a moment just after the turn of the millennium, and after 2000, around 2005, it is perhaps the most articulate moment when the Archbishop of the cathedral in Yaoundé gives this big sermon on Christmas Day, in which he accuses right in front of the president and the ministers and other dignitaries and their families, he accuses the national elite of engaging in same-sex practices, in witchcraft, and particularly as a form of imposition on young people in exchange for opportunities for social mobility. And of course, it's a moment of national discomfort for the elite. The Archbishop, later on, as we found out during our investigation, the Archbishop's sermon is transcribed, televised first, and then transcribed and republished in national newspapers. And with one of the newspapers, for instance, the Catholic national newspaper, Le Fort Camerounais, they made such a big deal out of it that the Archbishop felt the pressure to go back to them, because apparently the elite in Yaoundé called him and talked to him about this. And he, in turn, went to the editors of the newspaper and said, you have to revise some of the things I said. But what that moment did, what is remarkable about that moment, I have to say, is that right after the sermon of December 2005, in January 2006, there's a spectacular explosion of newspaper publications, tabloids, that create a scandal of the list of the top 50 homosexuals in the country, as they call them. And so there's almost a competition among the tabloids for documenting, according to them, or outing whom they feel are the top 50 homosexuals in the country. And from that moment onward, it is clear that homosexuality is a major theme that the elite have to take into account. And what is remarkable about this is that, unlike in other places in Africa where the idea of homosexuality the attack on homosexuality seems to be that it is the people down who were targeted. In the specific case of Cameroon and Gabon, as we show in the book, it is the elite that are targeted, so that it is the other way around. The use of the term homosexual or gay is directed primarily towards the elite. Of course, this is not to say that there are no same-sex people who are victims of homophobic violence. We show in the book amply that these attacks are ultimately devastating for same-sex people, because some people actually are killed. And what is remarkable is that the elite at this moment also feels they need to be on the defensive, and they, go on kind of repressive approach towards same-sex communities all through the decade from, I think, up to this point, because the repression continues, although perhaps less so than in those early years. I think a second point I'd like to point out in the book is this question of why it is that anusocracy is important as a kind of conspiracy narrative. Peter will talk in the end about, the idea of, the value of conspiracy thinking. But first, why is anusocracy very valuable in terms of unpacking the dynamics in Cameroon and in Gabon, in terms of what we see as post-colonial transformation? And the one is that given the spectacular inequalities going on, people began to think more and more in terms of what one can call new imaginaries of witchcraft. People were familiar with the older imaginaries of witchcraft that Peter and others have documented so well. But how is it that people will come to think about Freemasonry, homosexuality, and other kinds of what you call modern or European forms of associational life, like Rosicrucianism, as forms of witchcraft? What does it mean to think in such terms? Suddenly it flips, for us at least, it was surprising because it flips the script on what the idea of witchcraft as typically associated with African forms, to attach it to what one can call European forms in the context of Africa, at least. So that for me, for instance, it was surprising to think that Freemasonry could have become imagined as a form of witchcraft. And in terms of the Cameroonian and Gabonese case, what also that meant is that suddenly Freemasonry and homosexuality became inscribed in the broader struggle of narratives of decoloniality, so to speak, because once imagined homosexuality and Freemasonry imagined as European forms or Western forms, they were now seen as imposition on Africa and, in other words, inauthentic to the African, project. And so in the book, what we show is that activists, anti-Masonic activists, who are also, of course, homophobic, narrate anusocracy as a kind of project of resistance, if you want to call it that way. Of course, with all kinds of ambiguities, so that it is, on the one hand, in Cameroon, they are calling for the fight against the lodges, Masonic lodges. In the Gabonese case, it is actually a call to reform the lodges. In fact, asking, the activist is asking for European lodges to come and take over the lodges in Gabon and reform them. So it's not so clear what anti-decolonial here will mean, but certainly for them, that is what it involved. It's a kind of narrative of decoloniality. To resist the Freemasons, to resist the homosexuals, is to be decolonial or anti-colonial in that sense. So I think maybe at this point I can stop there, and then Peter can speak a little bit to the question of narratives of conspiracy, and which is ultimately the central argument of our book, and perhaps why the book is relevant way beyond Africa, I think, in my view. Peter, you are muted.
Yeah. I'm no longer, I think. Yeah. Okay, so thanks. And yeah, so I can say a little bit more, but very quickly, because our discussions should come in on to what extent conspiracy theory, conspiracy studies could help us did help us to address the central question. The central question of the book was, why is Cameroon and Gabon suddenly so homophobic? That Roger illustrated that very well. I mean, there was a big surprise around 2005. Suddenly, it was all about homosexuality, while before it was a topic you would not talk about. So why this sudden eruption of I think you can talk about homophobia. Some people refuse that term, but I think it is homophobia. And so we stumbled on conspiracy studies. Conspiracy studies is, of course, a very booming field with Trump and his alternative facts, with QAnon. People may be a little bit familiar with that. Pizzagate, all these conspiracy narratives, really an explosion in the West, also all over the world. You can say with social media, conspiracy narratives are all over. And for us, the question became, and was for more or less from the beginning, what position do you take as an academic? Conspiracy studies as a field became a kind of field of its own during the Cold War in America, for instance, and then the basic idea was refuting, of course, to refute conspiracy narratives about the deep state and etc., that they were not true. Lately, there's a kind of turn in conspiracy studies, which we found very interesting, from refuting to listening. Refuting, what's the use of showing that it's not true? What's the use of showing that QAnon is nonsense? People will still believe it. So the question is rather, why do they believe it? Why does some narratives have such visceral power? Why are people really feeling very, very deeply about how dangerous, what this kind of subtext, dangerous subtext. So for us, what we pretend that we give a new turn to conspiracy studies, but do we? By historicizing our conspiracy narrative. So the conspiracy narrative is about how Freemasons, it's a kind of triangle: Freemasonry, homosexuality, witchcraft, and why does this? We try to show how this suddenly became a kind of triangle that hang closely together. So what we try to show is that conspiracy thinking is kaleidoscopic. It's a kind of all sorts of elements and then suddenly some links take hold. Some links are convincing, not everything works, but suddenly. So the question is why such a sudden click? And because for Cameroon, you can say very clearly that the click was quite sudden. We take the figure of Ozula in our third chapter, I think. Yeah, I think it's the third chapter. As a starting point then, Ozula was a French politician who was very important in the decolonization of Cameroon in the 50s, saved Cameroon for France-Afrique, for the Gaullist version of what French Africa should become. He was deeply resented because of that. The true nationalists hated him and attacked him in all sorts of ways. The strange thing is that in the 80s, 70s, 80s, there were these attacks. Homosexuality did not play a role. After 2000, there this sudden click. Ozula. Sorry, is everything okay? Yeah, I hear all sorts of noises. Ozula came back in the discussions, all sorts of leaflets, newspaper articles. Ozula is a homo-Masonic figure. So now he's suddenly a homosexual, he's a Mason also, and he corrupted the whole Cameroonian elite. So in the 50s, 60s, they all were at his house in Paris, and there they were corrupted. So Biya and even Ahidjo, the first two presidents, were corrupted as homosexuals and corrupted in their turn the whole elite. So the Freemasonry is suddenly an organization to corrupt a nation. So the question is then why after 2000 there was a sudden click? Why suddenly these elements together are very, very believable, very convincing, and why do people really stick to that story? And the aim of the book becomes then to unravel this kind of the moment, this context, in which context these three elements could be brought together so strongly. And what you see then that we have to follow all sorts of traces, all sorts of registers. One very important thing is that access to internet and general spread of the idea of a gay global gay identity, and we use a lot Katrien's notion of connectivity. We hope we did it right, but we will hear that. And but another register, another trend is Mitterrand bringing back suddenly Freemasonry in French African politics. Freemasonry was kind of discarded by Vichy, and it was very kind of low key in up till the 80s, and then Mitterrand brought back Freemasonry because he needed a network in Africa, and Freemasonry had it. So you see all sorts of, there are many more trends, and they come together in a certain moment, and that could explain this click. And we are very happy with this idea of conspiracy theory as kaleidoscopic, and that the challenge is, so for academics, the challenge is not to refute it, not to say these links are nonsense, but to explain why in a certain moment certain links become very convincing. We use the example, for instance, of in US, the click between cheese sandwiches and children for satanic abuse. There's this kind of firm idea that Obama ordering cheese sandwiches for nocturnal meetings is really ordering children to be abused. So I think that example brings out very clearly why it can be so convincing. The elements are there all the time. Of course, the worst cheese sandwiches, there is the idea of satanic abuse. But if it's suddenly brought together, it gives the believer kind of feeling of revelation, I see something. Of course, I should have known it was all the time there, but suddenly I see a deeper link, and other people do not see it, and that gives this visceral power to this link. For instance, in Cameroon between Freemasonry and homosexuality corrupting the nation. So shall I stop? I can go on, of course, but we're talking too long, I
Yeah.
think. Yeah, yeah.
No, it's fascinating, and you could go on, but I think we should allow the readers to say something, and then maybe come back with some questions.
Certainly.
Thank you. Meredith.
Yeah, so thanks for starting us off with this. This book was something of an adventure. I share Shireen's comments starting out. I thought it was something of an adventure for a historian to read, certainly. So I want to start off with just a comment about the historicization of Freemasonry. And I just want to name a few figures like Blaise Diagne, starting with Blaise Diagne, who is the Senegalese elected to the French National Assembly in the early 20th century. He had become a Freemason in 1899. Matsois, which Didier Gondola has written a great biography of Matsois from the French Equatorial Africa, who became a Freemason in the early 20th century, the interwar period. Then if we go to Madagascar, we see Jean Khalaïmongo, who was a member of the Socialist Party. He was a leading spokesperson for Malagasy claims to French citizenship in the interwar period. Jules Ranaivo, another leader in the movement for citizenship in Madagascar in the 1920s and 30s. If we go to metropolitan France, we see Jules Alcandre, who was le pionnier de l'émancipation du peuple noir, so the pioneer of the emancipation of Black peoples. That's written on his tombstone in Paris. And he was a Black French international lawyer practicing in Paris in the interwar period. He's from Guadeloupe. He was a Freemason. His son, Sylvain Alcandre, who sort of takes up the mantle of his father's political work, also as a lawyer at the Supreme Court of Paris after the Second World War, travels across French Africa in the 1940s and 1950s. He's very interested in the trust territories of the United Nations. Cameroon was one of those. So that's actually the first place he visits in his travels in the late 1940s. And he actually runs in elections in Cameroon, I think against Ojula. So calling to mind these figures, the historical presentation that the book gives in chapter 2, the title of the chapter is From London via Paris to Africa. And so already the figures that I've enumerated kind of questions that geography in the chapter title. I think the chapter offers a very sort of metropolitan genealogy to Freemasonry. And I think when it comes to France, certainly Third Republic France, we could take a closer look. I think Freemasonry attracted colonial elite, certainly, as is pointed out in this chapter. But it also attracts legalists who belonged to the League of the Rights of Man, the LDH, in France at the time. And it seems to be sort of an interracial concern and to render the system of justice more egalitarian across the empire. So these are folks who, Freemasonry draws people who are committed to a uniform rule of law and universal justice across the empire. And it brings together an array of activists. So strange bedfellows, to use that English phrase. So you'll see communists, you'll see pan-Black agitators, such as those I've mentioned. You'll see anti-colonialists, you'll see advocates for citizenship, rights claimants, and so on. And this is also the time of sort of the emergence of a colorblind republicanism, I think, across the French Empire. So I guess just the knowledge that I have of, it is obviously a topic that interests me as well as a historian of rights claims at this time. across French Africa, including Cameroon. I'm not sure that I'm convinced that lodges were closed to Africans and to Africa descended people across the French Empire at this time, but I do feel as though that chapter kind of has that implication, and that a lot of what comes later, that implication that Africans were shut out of, or Black French were shut out of Freemasonry in this earlier colonial period, does some of the work later, moving forward from that chapter through the book. And so I'm wondering if we could maybe think, bringing to mind those figures who I've mentioned and many more, if we could sort of rethink about how Africa descended people came to Freemasonry in the 20th century, because to me it seems like joining a lodge was about access to a secret dimension of power. I mean, certainly the secrecy is there. Although it's kind of an open secret too in the interwar period. It's like very, I guess people know who is who and who is actually in, as opposed to like a conspiracy theory about who might be in. People will actually claim or state, unequivocally that they are Freemasons. So, but if we think about it as access to a secret dimension of power, how is that access then transformed and used to promote other causes, other ways of organizing, ways that enable transformative contributions to systems of governance, to systems of adjudication? And I guess what I'm suggesting is there's arguably an anti-colonialist vein to Freemasonry historically, whereas the authors, you seem to be presenting it as a pathway to a Cameroonian political elite's positioning within France-Afrique. So then what does that do to that more anti-colonial thrust, or at least a movement towards claiming rights? So there's a similar point that I could make about historicization that would be more relevant to the presentation of France-Afrique and neocolonialism in the work. At times, it seemed a little bit ambiguous as to whether France-Afrique and neocolonialism, or Cameroon being caught up in this neocolonial relationship with France. At times, it's presented as part of the conspiracy thinking that you're trying to elucidate. And at others, it seems as though it's being presented as a historically founded concern. So there was a bit of ambivalence there. And I think it's interesting, the use of history here, because the historical is presented as legitimizing arguments about this present day moment that you're most concerned with. But to me, the interpretive or analytical value of the historicization is not always obvious. So I guess that's the main point that I have, and I'd like to hear more about that later in the discussion.
Thank you, Meredith. Katrien.
Well, first of all, I want to say a big thank you to the authors, but also to the organizers of this event. For me, it was a pleasure to read this book, and I'm also excited for the opportunity for this conversation. Rogers and Peter have offered us a very sophisticated and nuanced analysis of conspiracy theories in contemporary Cameroon. Around 2005, Rogers and Peter, along with other various academic observers such as Basile Njio and Patrick Awondo, described a moral panic in Cameroonian society, articulated in narratives around same-sex, Freemasonry, and illicit enrichment. In their quest to understand the connections between these three, a wide array of figures and themes appear. These figures and themes crystallize in what Rogers and Peter call an epistemological knot. And I really like this concept, this epistemological knot, which they define as the presumption that the associations between homosexuality, Freemasonry, and illicit enrichment are self-evident to the believers. And this is what they're trying to unravel in the book. The book is a combination of history and anthropology, bringing together various libraries, sources, themes, and different methods of data collection and interpretation, as we've seen some snippets on the PowerPoint that Rogers has prepared. For example, along the way, we learn about the different histories of Freemasonry and Rosicrucianism in Europe, the US, and in Africa. We gain intimate insight into the wanderings and writings of the German adventurer, economic entrepreneur turned ethnographer Tesman, while we also get a history of colonial and post-colonial politics in Cameroon, where figures such as the Algerian-born medical Dr. Adjoula becomes a key figure in the continuing relations with France. In addition, most chapters contain comparisons between Cameroon and Gabon, for example, in the chapter on Freemasonry, and the chapter entitled Anxieties contains comparisons regarding attitudes towards or tolerance or lack thereof, attitudes towards homosexuality in Cameroon, Gabon, but also Senegal and Ivory Coast. Time and again, the differences are striking, and Rogers and Peter unravel these differences as historically grown. All of this helps them to denaturalize the conspiracy thinking at the heart of this book. And the latter is relevant as the authors not only want to contribute to theorizing in social sciences regarding conspiracy thinking and regarding queer studies, but they also attempt to contribute to the urgent question of homophobia in Cameroon and around the world. As those who are familiar with Rogers and Peter's individual publications already know, both Rogers and Peter write in a passionate, though very accessible manner, and this is, I can assure you, also the case for this book. It is written in a highly, as I mentioned, accessible style, but also erudite. And there is another aspect of the writing that I wish to highlight, because I think it's pretty unusual. It is an open and transparent writing style that you've engaged with. And this is striking. There's a striking transparency in the logical reasonings that Rogers and Peter have developed in their thinking about the conspiracy theories, which I think counters the opacity of conspiracy thinking in itself. So they try to show to the reader how they make sense of certain connections, how they interpret the relevance of certain texts and statements, or when something may suddenly seem less relevant, and they also explain it to the reader. This openness in their thought process seems to counter explicitly the opacity that conspiracy theories paradoxically characterizes. After all, as we know, conspiracy thinking relies a lot on unexplained and often illogical connections between words, events, figures, and meanings. So as in a kind of counter-performance, Rogers and Peter take the reader by the hand in their search of the knot and the unknotting of how ideas affects mainly anger, but also curiosity and a desire for sensationalism, and voices and events come together in what they call, and this is another keyword of this book, the assemblage of Freemasonry, homosexuality, and conspiracy thinking in Cameroon. We are invited to follow their reasoning, and at certain times they also indicate improbabilities and explain why. And I think this is a most refreshing element of the book. Another characteristic of the writing that I want to mention explicitly is also that Rogers and Peter rely a lot on scholarly work of Cameroonian, Gabonese, and Congolese scholars. And through them, through the insights of these Central African scholars, they are introduced to the Anglophone academic world. Obviously, they rely on classics as Achille Mbembe, who is here in the audience, also Francis Nyamjo, Joseph Tonda, Basil Njio, but then also we read about I encountered work by colleagues called Severin Cécile Abega, Daniel Abwa, Patrick Awondo, who I knew, Mongo Beti, who I knew as well, and then also public intellectuals from Cameroon, such as Simon Ken, Jean-Pierre Ombolo, Go Wongli Masaga. I'm sure I've mispronounced their names, I apologize. But there's a lot of working with, building on, learning from Central African scholars in this book, and I think it's worth mentioning this explicitly. In my discussion, I want to focus on three themes. First of all, the topic of connectivity and related to it, access, then the role of the internet, and then also the new approach to witchcraft that is proposed in this book. Topic of connectivity and related to that, access. access is probably, apart from assemblage, one of the most used words in this ethnography. Very often, Rogers and Peter use it in questions. And they ask, what does access mean? And then access to what? And very often, these are rhetorical questions. The answers are not there. And so it means that for the authors, access seems to be elusive. And I also think that's why access is not in the index of the book either, although I do think it's a very important one. Nevertheless, as we learn, the conspiracy theories all argue that Cameroonians, elites and young Cameroonians engage in homosexual practices with Freemasons in order to get access to power, access to riches, or even more vague, access to new opportunities. Yet how, what that access actually means remains a conundrum in the conspiracy theory narratives and also in the book. And I think this book actually invites us, your questions invite us to think further on what access mean, on like how social mobility is possible, what people imagine, how you get access to other social circles. What do you need to do? Which doors do you open? How do you open a door? What do you force? And I think one of the reasons why in this book and also in the conspiracy narratives, access is so elusive, is because it's so intimate on two levels. Intimate in the sense of hidden. So, secret, hidden, but then also intimate because very often it's related to the body. And so here, the access to the body in this book, obviously with Anus Kratzi, it's through the anus. But there are other ways through which the body give access to people. And I think one of the issues that this book, I hope discussions that this book will open further is indeed, forcing access, modifying access, facilitating access. This book begs for a further elaboration on it. Maybe so Rogers and Peter ask, like, what does access mean? Access to what? So maybe, we could also ask, why is access itself so contentious? Why is access, the problem? And that relates to the issue of connectivity. And connectivity in another sense of being connected to the internet. As I argue in a book chapter from 2018 that Rogers and Peter quote from time to time, we should not only think about connectivity in terms of digitalization, but we should also think about connectivity as a modality of personhood, of connecting with other people. And I think that contemporary discussions about connectivity and also the discussions about digital connectivity are very much related to the unknown. With whom do we connect over the internet? And so who are the strangers that others are meeting online? Who are the people that they are meeting in secret? What happens once you've entered the door, the hidden door, what happens then maybe in the dark? So I think what is so compelling is that this issue of connectivity, I think, and access is because it is a question about access beyond the familiar realms of the family and of the church and of the immediate community. There's no transparency when access is being questioned. When access is visible, it's not even called access. It's not problematized. It is when it's hidden, when it's uncertain, when it's dubious, when it's difficult, that access becomes contentious, that access becomes a topic to discuss. And I think your book points in those directions. My second issue, the second theme that I want to discuss in this book discussion relates to the digital then in itself, and especially the click. And it's so funny that Peter emphasized it in his introduction, because every time when the word the click appeared in your book, I was enchanted by it. So throughout the book, it appears that, the knot, the connecting, the concocting, the making of the linkages or the assemblage, thrives to a huge degree, as was also mentioned in the introduction, on the non-human actors of digital infrastructures, such as cyber cafes, in the early days, and nowadays social media platforms. And as was also mentioned by Peter, digitalization provides the missing link for the why now question of that assemblage. So Rogers and Peter indicate how digitalization of Cameroonian society is a double-edged sword for homosexuality. On the one hand, the digital world provides a safe space for non-heteronormative people. They found and find online communities that indicate that there are other people with similar sexual desires. And also, through the internet, as some of the protagonists in the book also, as it emerges, it is also through the internet that human rights activists get in touch with victims of homophobia in Cameroon, start campaigns, and can save, or at least assist. So that, one would say, is the positive side of the digital. Yet, Rogers and Peter remind us at the same time that digital presence also can work against safety of LGBTQ people. For example, gay bashing happens online as well, can be triggered through online hatred. There's also mockery and exposure, unsolicited exposure, unsolicited coming out even online. These themes have also been explored by colleagues in other gay cultures in Africa. For example, Austin Bryan has a beautiful discussion of LGBT communities in Uganda and the role of digital publics in the Journal of Eastern African Studies a few years ago in a special issue on digital publics. Now, what I found most refreshing is what Rogers and Peter call the sudden click, which as I read it, has various layers. In the first sense, and this is the layer that Peter already described in the introduction, the click refers to this sense of revelation, this aha experience, this sense of, bringing, understanding a kind of like, matching, all things suddenly make sense in the conspiracy logic. People connect certain themes, images, narratives, figures into a whole that makes sense to them, to the believers. And so this sudden click then, can create visceral popular indignation and so on. But it's very important because it's that sudden click that helps people to understand their world and how they act upon that. So this click, is key. I think in the way in which the assemblage of the different ingredients of the assemblage suddenly become powerful. And so I think this click is very important. But there's another layer, which I think is there as well, and which is, also connected to the digital and, and to it's also analogous to the conspiracy thinking or certainly the aha experience. It's just that in our digital society, this is how we inhabit our world. We go from one click to the other click. So I think your description of the sudden click has also much to offer to digital humanities as such, insofar as it represents a contemporary practice of popular hermeneutics. It is online, or the online at least is an important ingredient of how we, not only our interlocutors, but anyone suddenly understands their life world. And Victoria Bernal, one of the leading digital anthropologists, in her book of 2014, Nation as Network, she even described her methods of doing ethnography online, as, going from one link to the other. She calls it a viral method. But, this sudden click is something that, we all have in common. People who believe in conspiracy theories, all of us, for whom the digital is an important element in making sense of our live worlds, but also in our ethnography, in the way in which we collect data, and maybe we dialogue with our interlocutors. And I saw that Rogers in his PowerPoint had this slide on multimodal ethnography. I would say you're doing a lot of clicking in your ethnography. So finally, the question of witchcraft. It's in the final chapter, so everybody who was curious or who is curious to read how witchcraft plays a role in this assemblage needs to be patient until the very final chapter. But then, suddenly there's also this new thing that comes in, which I think you could have emphasized more and done more with, and I hope you can explain a bit further, explain a bit more here in this conversation, and maybe in another publication, an article or something, you can do something with it. Because, so in the final chapter, Rogers and Peter mention that witchcraft actually is the missing link between Freemasonry, illicit enrichment, and same-sex arrangements. So if the digital is the explanation of the why now, witchcraft is the explanation why in Cameroon or why in Central Africa. And they come up with a new definition of witchcraft, which I think is, pretty revolutionary. In this book, Rogers and Peter describe witchcraft as the world of the doubles. They draw on the work by Séverin Cécile Abega, who describes beliefs about homosexuality among the Beti ethnic group. And he describes it as, Abega describes it as a mismatch in the gender of the physical body and one's invisible double. So you can have a male body, but the spiritual double is female. So one's double normally is of one's own sex, but for others, the double can be of the opposite sex. So a homosexual has the wrong double. The gender of the spiritual double is wrong. According to Rogers and Peter, this helps us to broaden the notion of witchcraft because it is devoid of any pejorative implications. And they argue, they continue, and here I'm quoting them, clearly we need more fluid approaches to understand the basic ambiguities in which people's abilities and actions are caught. Now, and they actually also think that this is a solution, this could provide a solution out of the moral panic, the LGBTQ witch hunt, we could actually say, right? But they're not using that word, I think. So they ask, to what extent can the emphasis on the plurality of the person, as it emerged in this chapter, on the ambiguities of kaleidoscopic combinations of doubles underlining the relativity of all binary oppositions, further provide solutions in this minefield of, the dangerous positionality of LGBTQ plus people in Africa. And I think these are two important issues. So we not only get a revision of the witchcraft definition, but we also get an opening to use these ethnographic insights in LGBTQ plus activism. However, Abega's description on which they are building is actually exactly the same as what Pentecostals say in Kinshasa. So in Kinshasa, 2 decades ago, I studied Pentecostalism in Kinshasa and evangelization efforts in the city, especially evangelizing television serials. And homosexuality was also an important topic in the television serials and in the discourse, the preaching, and so on. And so gay subjectivities were depicted in these serials in exactly the same manner. So it was explained that a homosexual person, his spiritual double is feminine, and that explains feminine behavior and so on. So, and sexual desire is dominated by the spiritual double. in that logics. Now, the problem is that there is a moral dimension here, because in a Pentecostal discourse, this mismatch, is a problem. And you need deliverance rituals, because God in the design, God never makes a mistake. The mismatch has diabolical origins. And so what is needed, homosexuals need to be delivered from an evil spirit or from diabolical influence. So there's a mistake in the design that is diabolical, according to Kinshasa's Pentecostals. So then my question is, how do we deal then, with this, if, among the Beti culture, you've got that, that idea which is devoid of any immoralizing discourse. If we know that Pentecostalism is so important in many African societies, then how can this information, these ethnographic insights, help us in LGBTQ activism? How to respond, and also how to deal, with these conspiracy narratives, where Pentecostal or other moralizing discourses nevertheless continue to accompany ideas of witchcraft. So I think that's my main question here. So in concluding, again, I want to thank Rogers and Peter for having written this wonderful book. I enjoyed reading it, and I'm sure it will be widely consulted, cited also, and I for sure will use it in a new course that I'm giving next semester, Cultural Anthropology, where I will use it as an excellent example of an ethnography of assemblages. Thank you.
Thank you, Katrien. Also, just to tack onto your last point, I also found the discussion of the ethics of doing this research absolutely spot on and interesting, and thought, oh, I'm going to give this to all my students to read, actually. So thank you very much. Rogers and Peter, would you like to respond to these comments? Yeah.
Yes, very much so. But maybe this time Peter starts and then I can end.
Sure. Okay.
Peter, how do you
Start, but whatever you want.
Go ahead,
Go.
Peter.
Okay,
Yeah.
I'll start. Thanks a lot. Terrific. So much food for thought that I have to lay down and just digest it, I think. But thanks a lot. For Meredith, thanks a lot for bringing in a lot more history. And it's quite clear we should be more modest in that second chapter. The idea was especially to trace why this link in Francophone context of Freemasonry and homosexuality. That had to be the kind of and that is really, and I'm not sure we solved it, and that is a riddle, because I mean, the colleagues who work on Freemasonry in Latin America or in most of British Anglophone Africa said, what the hell are you talking about? Why is this so important? Well, it is strange. It is important in Francophone context, so that's what we were looking for. But of course, there's a lot more, and we do not pretend to give a full history of Freemasonry. We should have made that clear in Africa. But all the figures you were mentioning are what is very interesting. For instance, Blaise Diagne was never into an African lodge. He was member of a French lodge. So his role as Freemason was hardly present in Africa, and there's this strange contradiction, because you're stressing the anti-colonial message in Freemasonry, but there was a long fight between the Centre Lodge, with the Grand Orient and Paris, like with the London Lodge, with Indian lodges. The Grand Orient was constantly reproaching lodges on the ground in French Africa, in Senegal and all that, of not allowing, not recruiting African members. But there was always a tension, so the anti-colonial tendency was quite present in the centers, in Paris and London, but very little present on the ground. And also very quickly in India, for instance, I know that maybe it goes too far, but in India, as soon as there were more educated Indians, so there were Indian lodges allowed Muslim royals, chiefs and all that, they could become member. As soon as there were Hindu, kind of quite a lot of educated Hindus, they kind of balked and they closed it to. So in that sense, that's an explanation why we did not write much more about the anti-colonial tendency. And the problem is also that Freemasonry is always very ambivalent. There is no one. There were anti-colonial tendencies, but there's a whole book of what's he called it? We quoted somewhere on Freemasons as builders of empire, especially so in that sense. But we should have written a lot more about it, and I loved what you say about the way of organizing. That is very interesting. Freemasonry was offering a new way. That came back also a little bit with Katrien is offering new ways of organizing. Katrien raises so many points that I really cannot address them all, but they are wonderful. Access, of course, we should have done more, but access came in as a surprise for us. I owe a lot to Kim Nguyen. Oh, he writes very good on gay presence of gay culture in Abidjan, and access is very much a language there. And we are fooled by it. We should follow it up but it remains mystical. It's the idea, and you describe it very well. We could do a lot. It's a kind of modality of a person. What we are still not sure. We included a brief interlude about the contrast between but they don't call themselves lesbian affairs outside the activist tone, and gay affairs in Africa. And there's a striking difference in that in the very good monographies we have now, but very recently on everyday women's sex contact, that the internet is not there, which is very puzzling. But for the people we talked to, the internet was a kind of revelation. I mean, the idea that when they suddenly saw on the internet that there were more people who had these desires and all that. And I find it very interesting, the kind of version of sex related to secrecy as positive, while for gays it's a kind of opening up, and very much the modality of person. I like that a lot. I'm very interested that you want to offer to prescribe the book to digital anthropology. I feel like a digital Luddite. I hate digitalization, so I love it. So please do it. But it is the idea of clicking. Of course, it is relevant. I presented the idea to summer school with historians from the Central European University in Budapest, and they loved it. It's click. Suddenly everybody was talking about click, and it's not. It comes out of the empiry. In Cameroon, there is something. Suddenly, that it is quite striking how sudden things go. And indeed, as a central thing for digitalization, it's wonderful. The big challenge, the idea of the double is used by the Pentecostals, of course. We had a panel with Achille, who suddenly, the wonders of digitalization, Achille seems to be present there as well. That's real. Wonderful. We had a panel in Chicago where we were quarreling about Africans not being ready for monotheism. Pentecostalism strikes in many senses as well. I've never studied them, and I had Pentecostal students, and I loved them, but not for the Pentecostalism. I mean, it is hard to swallow. You cannot say it's un-African, but they turn everything on its head. Well, it is what you say. shows the force of this idea of the person as double, the person as multiple, as incomplete, but it is again, yeah, it is certainly ambivalent. It can be a kind of liberation, but it can also be used as the double is the devil. And with the Pentecostal is always the devil. Then it's quite frightening, but yeah, probably not always, but often. But I think, well, in the book we try to be modest. The contribution for LGBTQ studies is, I think, that we emphasize so strongly this popular association of homosexuality with witchcraft and with enrichment, with secret enrichment. And that we were very struck by, of course, that's not just in Africa, but it's very strong in all African examples. Also historically, this idea of same-sex is a kind of way to enrich yourself, which I find very, and why it's not often not clear exactly. So we should kind of develop that more. But I think it's in any case, if you want to understand popular anger against homosexuals in Africa, you have to take that into account. It's completely absent in activist publication, and I can understand why, because it's kind of ugly and it's not positive. But you have to address it. You have to take it into account because it can explain homophobia. So that is some sort of contribution, but in the final chapter, we try to show that this kind of idea of the person as we use Jane Geyer's multiple self-realization. For her, it's very economically, but it's very striking in many studies now of alternative sexual arrangement, that there is a kind of possibility of playing all sorts of registers at the same time. And I think that is kind of wonderful. And as a Westerner, for me, it's striking the way people escape pigeonholing, they escape the idea of a fixed identity. It's wonderful, and there's some hope that at least that's how we managed to get to a positive end. But it's not really an answer. But thanks a lot for all the comments.
Thanks, Peter.
Yes.
Rogers, a couple of minutes, and then we'll see if there's about.
Sorry.
People could just say in the chat if they want to ask a question.
All right, so I'll just be quick. I want to say thank you to Meredith and to Katrien for really thought-provoking and very generous comments from both. I think perhaps to add a little bit to what Peter was saying with regards to Meredith's query, she's probably right in terms of our not being clear enough whether it is our endorsement of these conspiracy narratives or whether we're just presenting them. We could have been more clear on that. But I want to quickly say that I think the specific history of decolonization is what is very interesting for us and what makes it so prominent in terms of the way that we follow this. The role that Ojula plays, the figure of Ojula, for instance, plays, and especially the history of decolonization and the how it turns out with UPC, and maybe there we should emphasize that there is where the link certainly becomes more and more prominent in terms of the connection of the story from Cameroon to France, to metropolitan France. I think that's and it struck me as you were giving these wonderful comments that it seems to be that it is not just us who think that it is also true in the history, in the historical connection, that the socialists were very much closer to the Masonic circles, and the African socialists would more probably or more likely have been. And certainly when we in our book, what we found is that for the socialists, that turned out to have been the only network that was reliable at a certain time. And that's what Peter was talking with Mitterrand turning to Africa, turning to the Masonic connections in order to have a kind of new network in Africa, which is of course opposite to what de Gaulle and Foucault had, which is a suspicion of the Masonic network as something they could not rely on. For Katrien, I think, I mean, there's, just like Peter says, so many things that you lay out, which some of which in the end, I have to confess, surprised me a little bit. So, but in a good way. So thank you so much for the generosity. I have to say that this question of access, why is access so contentious? I think it's a very wonderful way of putting it. And when you say that when access is hidden or dubious, that is when it is contentious, it actually it allows me to underline an important aspect in terms of the dynamics of secrecy and openness, and to say the very important role that publicity plays here. So that in the end, it's a question of how people negotiate the dynamics of advertising or openness and secrecy. So for instance, one of the events that we described is when the Masons themselves stage and the Grand Master in ceremony for Bongo, and then go and lick it up on YouTube, right? So that it's this question of how to advertise. It's secret, but how to advertise enough in order to attract sufficient interest, and which is very much Simelian in that sense. The question of the secret has value only insofar as people have some kind of knowledge of its existence in that way. So I will stop there and maybe allow Shireen to collect other questions from the audience if time will allow. But if not, then we can go back and I can comment further on some of the things you raised.
I'm going to open it up for a discussion. Thank you, Rogers, and Peter, for your responses as well. And if you could raise your hand if you want to make a comment or ask a question, you could do either. While you are thinking, no, while you're thinking, I wondered a little bit about, it's a really rich book, and I'm not suggesting you should have done very much more, but what I was thinking about was some of the lexicon of money and sex, not only sex and secrecy, but the wealth issue here in the book, right? And I was thinking about the earlier literature of people like Aikwe Ama and so on, in which there's this attachment of filth and dirt to the exchange of money, and that sort of seems to map on to the kind of religious sentiments of contamination and defilement and so on that go along with sex. And so, not that I think you should have added a chapter, but I'd be interested in a post-book article in which you sort of pull out some of those metaphorical elements that are at play in the book. So it's just something that I think was really interesting. Vanessa, do you want to unmute yourself and introduce yourself?
Thank you all for the discussion. It was really interesting. I'm happy to hear about the book just quickly because I am Ugandan and my current work is on narratives about witchcraft in Uganda. And I've found anecdotally that like the same things I hear from people about, worrying from Pentecostal friends, family, people that I know about worrying about me doing this research, the kind of be careful, they'll suck you in, they'll get you, is similar to some narratives that I hear about me living in a place like Canada and living in the West and being careful that they don't suck you into homosexuality and like the conspiracy around that. So, and even there's been like recent moral panics and public panics about, people targeting kids in school, which kind of also mirrors similar panics about child sacrifice in Uganda to do with witchcraft. And there's a lot of similarities there. So this was really interesting for me. My question is, and I wonder for the people that you talked to that were kind of the subjects of this conspiracy, like the people who are homosexual, the people who are, you know, maybe participating in witchcraft, I'm curious to hear what they thought about this kaleidoscope of conspiracy and how they understood it in their own lives, if they were just like, it's stupid, or, you know, if they had their own thoughts about this kind of, yeah, conspiracy triangle that you uncovered.
Well, thank you very much, Vanessa. I think Peter and I, there's a photo when I was sharing the slides. There's a photo of Peter and I together in Gabon, in Libreville, where we first we did a conference presentation, and then we went off to a lodge of Rosicrucians, and there we were talking with members of the lodge. He's not the grandmaster, but he obviously was very important. I can't remember what his exact role was, and then he was with some other people who are members, including a lady. And when we started discussing this with them, and he said that they are surrounded in, they're like an island in a sea of hostility. So the lodge is obviously very conspicuous by virtue of its imposing structure, and all around it is a lot of misery. You can see misery. Even the bridge to the small bridge to the lodge is in a terrible state. But he insisted a lot that on this question of people looking at this imposing structure and looking at the external signs of wealth, and associating these with their witchcraft. And what that means is, in the end, that they have, he said, have tried several times in the past to make efforts to connect with the people around the community, around the lodge, but the hostility is just too much, that they have retreated and barricaded themselves, in their lodge. So they don't live in that building, but whenever they come, they stay there. They don't engage with the people outside, which I found to be certainly strange in terms of what African neighborhoods are. But it is this culture of avoidance. And in terms of your experience of narratives, of suspicion, what if one calls it that you are in the West and you could become contaminated by the sea of homosexuality as it is. There's no undermining or undermining the role that kind of discourse has played, even here in the election that just played out here in the United States, where people in Africa seem so invested in what has happened in America, largely because of the question of homosexuality. So many people in the WhatsApp groups I belong to are so enthusiastically supportive of Trump because of the assumption that Trump is, Trump and the Republican Party are anti-same-sex questions and issues. That there will be, and largely because of a kind of Pentecostalist moralizing vision. So there's this is all to say that you're not unique in Uganda. If you go to Cameroon or Nigeria, that's what you're going to get. That people in Africa are so invested in what is happening in the West, largely because of the same-sex question. And I found that to be very surprising and new in a way, in the last few months that I've been, last 2 years, but especially in the last half year that I'm here, that Africans are very much invested in same-sex issues in the West, not just same-sex issues in Africa.
In what sense? In the sense that they are
they think that
struck by it, or that they find it horrible, or what?
Yes, for the most part, they find that the political establishment here, now that Trump was not in power, was supportive of same-sex communities, and that with Trump's return to power, certainly that's going to change, not just here, but also for Africa. The narrative is just so terrible.
I think
How,
it's true of Eastern Europe as well, by the way. This is
certainly.
rising sense of a fear that somehow LGBTQ are a sort of fundamental threat to the security of nation and family and so on. So, I mean, in the sense that that in your book you talk about Africanizing queerness. I think we see these connections across the world, and maybe they have specific iterations in the combination assemblages in the different parts of the world, but there's something very similar right across.
Well, it's oh, sorry.
No, go ahead. And I was just all I was going to say is I think it must make us question it must make us question the moment in which we are living, and the nature of society and state at the moment.
And you can be more specific. I mean, it's gay marriage. Gay marriage, the kind of backlash against gay marriage is global. I mean, Latin America, Caribbean, and especially gay marriage does a lot of harm to gays outside the West. But your questions about money is very interesting, and we should do more with it. What's very striking is this. So the stories about same-sex bringing enrichment are not. It's not just same-sex. In Cameroon, for instance, there was a time now I hear less about it. There were cases where a madman who walks naked in the street had to fuck a rich woman on a crossroad in view of in order to protect her riches. So, and from Senegal, we got especially those stories that gay people were quite surprised with men. Gay men were quite surprised that they were approached by men who wanted to have sex with them, who were not at all gay, but who the marabout had told them that they had to have same sex in order to protect their riches. And they were kind of... and they talk about it as very strange, but the link is certainly there, and there is this field that helps money, something like that. And so we could do a lot more about it. I'll give Vanessa's question is very, very important. How people feel about this association of homosexuality with witchcraft. I'm very puzzled. Bashir Dio and I wanted to do for some time a paper about it. Maybe we ever do it. Why is this association of homosexuality with witchcraft? I work in Cameroon since 1971, and homosexuality used to be a completely forbidden topic. I never dared to touch it because it was really certain if you're gay yourself, you better stay away. I mean, it is criminalized in Cameroon. The only way I met it was always the witches. So the witches at night, when they meet, they have sex, but in a transgressive sex, and they would say man with men and even women with women. That was even worse. My informants were men. These are stories of men. So this association is very deep and goes back really. And it's everywhere also. So in many parts of Africa, it goes back, and it is kind of obvious. A colleague of mine, I won't mention names, but he was reputed to be a witch. But I was completely, why would a poor man be a witch? But he had made homosexual openings to his driver and all that. I mean, then immediately you are a witch. So that's also for me was the reason why I didn't dare to touch the topic. And if I would work in the village now, I still would not dare to touch it, I would say. Why it is of course, I mean, it's present in European imagination also, but not so. But it's kind of hidden by the devil. The devil hides all these things, but there is certainly an association with transgressive sex there also. So it is not just to Africa, but it's very strong in Africa. I don't know. we should work more about it. People, the gay people I talked to in Cameroon would just ignore it and would say this is nonsense, and they would. And that's also why internet was such liberation, that there were other kinds of imaginaries about same sex. But Meredith looks very quizzical. Meredith, you don't agree or what?
But we actually have run up against our deadline, and I can see that people are beginning to leave for their class, and they have so I'm going to say thank you very much for we can obviously continue to discuss this for a lot longer. Thank you for a great book that's provoked so much discussion, Peter and Rogers. Thank you to Katrien and Meredith. Our next seminar in 2 weeks is Claudia Gastro's new book, The Aesthetics of Belonging, Indigenous Urbanism, City Building, and the Oil Boom in Luanda. So please join us for that.
And thanks a lot to Shireen for organizing all this wonderful.
Thank you, Shireen.
And to
thank
the
you,
discussants,
Meredith,
really.
and thank you, Katrien. I hope to see you all soon in person.